I lived in New Mexico for several years before moving to the Midwest. My friend, Amy, and I are both females and would spend days exploring the most remote corners of New Mexico, discovering abandoned ghost towns, enjoying the quiet, desolate beauty of the desert. One afternoon in March 2010, we were travelling from Brediso to Albuquerque. Always up for exploring, we took a back road rather than travelling the more direct highway. One leg of our journey had us on the NM55. It's a remote, teeny tiny, 2-lane highway. We love those kinds of roads though. This part of New Mexico is flat and desolate desert. You can see for miles, and there is virtually nothing except for dirt and rock between towns, and towns can be miles away from each other. So we're on the NM55 going north. After a couple of minutes, we saw a white pickup truck ahead of us going the same direction. Suddenly, he stopped his truck sideways in the middle of the highway, blocking both lanes. We're about a mile away from him. As we get closer, we begin to get uneasy. We see no reason for him to do this. We were the only other vehicle out there, and began to wonder if we should turn around, rather than come up to him to stop. We're about half a mile away from him, when he pulled over to the opposite side of the highway. But his truck was still pointed in the direction we were going. We tried to relax a little. Surely, this guy was a rancher or something. Maybe he was checking something on the land. As we were passing him, we noticed a few things. 1. There was only one person in the truck, a middle-aged guy who never took his eyes off us. 2. He has a walkie-talkie. A few seconds after we passed him, he pulls back onto the highway and began following us, but he never got too close. He would get within a car length away, then drop back a little, then speed up again to within a few car lengths. We were getting scared. We realised how alone we really were. We had seen no other traffic on the road. We hadn't told anyone about our great idea of this detour. We check our cell phones. No one had signal. This is typical for being out in a remote part of New Mexico. But scary, given our present situation. Amy was driving and speeding up, while I frantically checked the map, hoping to find a road that would have more traffic. There was no other road. We had to travel this one to the next town, Mountainair. Turning around to go back the other way didn't seem like a good option. After a few minutes, we saw another pickup truck coming towards us. He was going very, very slowly, maybe 20 if that. This pickup was old and beat up, whereas the one behind us was newer. Amy had us up to 80, and we blew by the old pickup. As we passed it, we saw this another middle-aged guy. He was talking into a walkie-talkie. After the white pickup passed him, he pulled a U-turn and pulled it in behind. As we watch all of this, we can see the white pickup truck guy talking into his walkie-talkie. No doubt these two knew each other. We were being deliberately followed, and for the first and only time in my life, I felt hunted. They stayed right behind us. We watched for obstacles in the road. We truly thought old beat up pickup guy had set a trap in the road and our vehicle would be disabled somehow. We talked about driving into the fields, but this was obviously their territory. We were afraid of what would happen if we went off-road and got concerned, so we stayed on the highway. By now, the white pickup truck guy was right on top of us. We could see him talking into the walkie-talkie. He stayed right on our bumper, and old, beat-up pickup truck guy was right on top of him. The three of us were speeding down the highway. The white pickup inched closer to us. His maneuvering and edging closer made it apparent he was trying to bump us. I watched in a helpless fashion as he got within inches of our back bumper. Amy floored it. We were passing 80 miles per hour, up to 90. The road was flat and deserted. But any little thing going wrong would have been catastrophic. We absolutely were not going to slow down or stop if we could help it. The white pickup pulled into the opposite lane and began to gain speed. The only thing we could think of that was that he wanted to help pass us and get in front of us. If he got in front of us, his body would have been behind. Then we would have been boxed in and trapped. We looked around frantically at the rocky desert on both sides of us. Our only option was to off-road it. Could we risk it? Could we speed through the desert to make it safely out of there? As we topped a small incline, we read a sign saying, Missions National Monument, and it pointed to a road towards the left. And at this moment, a blue pickup truck pulled out onto the road in front of us. As we come up to it, we saw the plates, US Park Service. We both looked at each other, and then behind us. Both pickup trucks did U-turns and went the other way. We followed the blue pickup to the Mountaineer and made our way to Albuquerque. I don't know exactly what them guys' intentions were. They weren't good though. There was seriously something wrong here. I notified the state police. They said they would keep an eye on stuff. Now the area is very near Blenheim, NW, which is where Tara Chalico was abducted. I wrote a couple of days ago about the creepy mime talker. This is by no means the only creepy thing that's happened to me. And the more I thought about it today, the more I realised I have had over my fair share of scary encounters. Sooner or later, I'll add them all, but what I'm writing now is by far the most terrifying thing ever to happen to me. When I was in my early 20s, I had a friend with a psychotic alcoholic father. She didn't live with him. He lived in a remote little coastal town. Now and again, we would go together to visit him and stay the night. My relationship with him was creepy in itself, but that isn't the subject now. One night when we're visiting, my friend and her dad had a drunken blow up and he kicked all of us out. It's about midnight. We had gotten a lift down and didn't have a car. My friend's dad lived about 4 kilometers out of town. This is by the way of a dirt road. We started walking down the dirt road to town, where there was a telephone booth. This was in the days before it was commonplace to have a mobile phone. I was going to call my folks, who lived about an hour and a half away, and see if they'd get us. The whole way to town, my friend was drunkenly moaning and crying about her relationship with her dad. She hadn't let up by the time we got to the phone booth. She sat on a bench next to the phone while I woke up my parents. They agreed to come get us, and I sat down on the bench for the long wait. Shortly after, a van appeared and parked just behind the bench we're sitting on. Maybe 5 meters away, there were 2 young men in the front seats. They're looking at us. If that didn't make us nervous enough, the van door has slid open. I saw there's a number of guys in the back. I don't remember how many. More than 2. The place we were sitting at was deserted. There was no houses nearby it, just more road. No people, nowhere to run. No one driving by it. It's a crappy little nowhere town. I stood up so I could see them better, and kept my eyes fixed on the van full of men, acutely aware of our vulnerability. And what I saw was they were looking back at us. They were talking amongst themselves, quickly at first and quietly. Then they began talking more loudly. It became evident they were deliberately talking loud enough for us to hear them. They were talking about pulling us into the van, taking us somewhere to kill us. My whole body was shaking. I was in terror. I could not take my eyes off the men. I remember the face of one of them so clearly. I could draw it. He was just sitting on the door of the van, looking at me with no expression, looking at me with dead eyes. He was looking at me as though I were an item. All this time my drunk friend had stopped sobbing by herself. Whether she knew the van was there or not, I couldn't say. I knew I had to tell her about the danger, but I was actually so full of terror. I could not move, I could not speak. That was when the most incredible thing happened. My friend's father, who has never apologized to anyone in his life, and is the most awkward prick I've ever met, drunk in his car. It's hard to describe how unlikely it was for him to do this. He would hold a grudge like no one you've ever met. I know a couple of people like that. He was a stubborn guy. He and my friend had an emotional reunion. The whole time, my eyes were fixed on the van. The men had stopped talking and were just watching us. "Let's go," I said. We got back in the car and started heading for my friend's dad's house. The van started up and began to follow us. I tried to explain to my friend's dad about the men, but he said, "I'll slow down, they'll pass." They slowed down to a crawl behind us, then began shouting, screaming threats. They followed us all the way down the dirt road, and then all the way down the driveway to my friend's dad's house. They just sat in the van behind us, and we sat in the car, waiting to see what would happen. All of my friend's dad's neighbours were in holiday homes. Nobody was home that night. We knew that if the group of men decided to get out of the van and carry an attack, no one would help. After a very long time, the van backed out of the driveway and left. My parents then arrived in a panic at the home when they couldn't find us at the shops. My friend's dad hid in shame and went back to the family's house. I'd been asked if I went to the police, but I can't remember. I don't think I did. It's the most messed up incident of my life, and one that changed me forever. I'm a very fearful person now, and very overprotective of my kids. I don't want that to change. I'd rather be like this than accidentally trust one of the million psychopaths out there. Yesterday morning, I was unfortunate enough to suffer a power cut, and spending my day in total darkness is not something I enjoy. I ended up wandering around town throughout the day to kill some time. After spending a few hours at my old university, I decided to go to a hotel for me and my dog, as a power outage was expected to last at least a few days. We live in the south where no aircon can be a big issue. I finally managed to find somewhere nearby that will book me and my puppy without costing us an arms and a leg. That's when everything went downhill though. I would need to get a cab from my old school, back home, then back to the hotel. Everything is within 3 miles of each other. I figured it would be simple. I wasn't aware that there was a late graduation ceremony going on every time I tried to call a cab, so they wouldn't show up, or somebody else would take them. When the sun started to set, I found somebody who was a previous classmate of mine. They gave me a ride home. I packed up my stuff, called another cab, and lo and behold, it didn't feel like coming. Uber wasn't working either, so I decided I would take my bag, my pup, and walk the mile or so to the hotel. So I started walking. About a quarter of the way there, I hear someone behind me and enter my nightmare. A 6-foot-something brick house of a person with a ghastly look about them. They look down at me and my dog and say, "Hey girl, where are you going?" Now, let it be known I'm new to this area. I am from the middle of nowhere, and this is horrifying to me. I decide my options were to be incredibly polite, or to run screaming. I opted for politeness. After rejecting him taking my bag multiple times, he stated he was walking to the place right next to my hotel, so I decided to try and humanize myself as much as possible and keep a dialogue. He asked me a few questions about my family, friends, why I'm here. I made a bit of a story that I had a family and they were there for graduation, so it seemed like I had a couple of people expecting me. Shortly after, he reaches into his pocket and says, "You might need this," as he gives me a small knife. Not knowing what to say, I just looked at him, but said thank you a couple of times. Moments later, he's talking to himself, looking at me, and inviting me to live with his niece and her boyfriend. Internally, I'm screaming. I know I could do nothing. This guy has at least 1.5 feet over me, and I'm well and truly exhausted. We continued walking, and he's telling me he gets a good vibe from me. He could see us with a family. He kept on muttering to himself about tons of stuff. People, girls. It's very hard to make out what he's saying though. He looks at me and says, I had a pinry. I realised he meant epiphany, but how he said it was weird. I said, oh. He just smiled and did a head shake and kind of chuckled to himself, muttering, good night, good night. I figured out that it's alright. We're about halfway there, and I'm holding a conversation listening to how he went from prison for 2 years over a gun to how Snoop Dogg dedicated a song to him. We get to a very dark part of the walk. He looks at someone walking towards us and pushes me to the side of the sidewalk that is away from the street and says, you walk here now, who's your mind now? Suddenly, people walking from their cars from graduation walk past us. I feel safer. I know I'm home free. As we approach the hotel parking lot, he says, can he join me? I make up some excuses about how it's only booked for one person and it's not in my values. He follows me to the lobby. He follows me to the desk. I am told that I can't stay because I'm 20, not 21. They had a policy change. My heart sinks. He is attached to my side. I can't tell anyone how terrified I am. I see a worker at another desk, so I say I'm going to the bathroom. I whisper to her, can you please take me somewhere? I'm in an emergency. She escorts me away, and I explain that he's been following me for a while, and that he's trying to talk to another person now to use their ID, now calling it our room. An employee walks over and says, do you know this girl? He replies baffled, yeah, it's my girl, we've known each other years. She looks at him and asks for my name. She's my girl, he says. She tells him that if he does not leave the lobby, the police will be called. It then ends up that she's a bartender. She sits me down and ended up helping me get to my room. I'm not sure what the police said to him, but he's been outside for hours now, on and off in the following morning. Yesterday, I had a moment that scared me pretty bad. I live in a town of about 11,000 in rural Wisconsin. Not by preference, but for a job. We're moving when I get a better one. I was on my way to my employer's home. He runs a company out of his basement until we get a new office. I was being tailgated bad by a ratty blue car and a white bald guy. I drive a Kia Soul, which had a flat back end. So, if I can't see your headlights, you're a mere few inches off my butt. You will get me tapping on my brakes. This guy did. He honked at me whenever I flipped him off and slowed down to 5 miles under the speed limit. There wasn't anyone behind him, so I wasn't ruining anyone else's day. He had chances to pass me on the country road, but never did. After a few minutes with no other cars around, and him still kissing my bumper at 50, I grabbed my cell phone, pretended to turn around quickly to take a picture of him. Then I pretended to call 911. I'm in the country with no other cars around, and this guy was getting creepy. I eventually came to my turn. I went left, and he followed me. I then come to a roundabout and thought I would lose him. I travelled the entire route twice. He followed me. At this point, I knew he was messing with me, trying to scare me. Well, I decided to let myself be late to the meeting. I began to drive to the police station. He followed me the whole way there. I pulled up and parked, ready to run inside. I thought he would leave. Nope. He parked right next to me and just stared, and pulled up on my side of the car, close enough that I would have a hard time opening the door all the way. He's in his 40s, I'm guessing, wearing sunglasses and a creepy smile. He was wearing fairly neat clothes, nothing scary there. The interior of the car was pristine. I should mention that I'm training to be a behaviour analyst, and I work with kids now. My hobby is criminal behaviour and profiling. I was trying to read the guy. A few seconds went by. I grabbed my phone again, this time intent on calling 911 from the police station parking lot. As I dialed, his passenger side window rolled down, said nothing, rolled it up and took off. I went inside and told the officer what happened. Sadly, I was too focused on not crashing to get a plate, but apparently there's been a lot of complaints about the tailgaters recently, multiple with a blue car. I filled out a report with the police officer, and they gave me a card for victim services and a local women's shelter, just in case he followed me home that night and I didn't feel safe. I went out to my car and there was a note on the windshield. I opened it. It had a smiley face on it, in red. Serious horror movie stuff. I took it back inside. The officer said he'd call me a few times during the night, and I should avoid going anywhere alone for a while. He did call twice and say that he was patrolling again. This is a small town, and the attitude here is very communal. So I feel safe knowing that there's some backup. If I ever see him again, I have no question I'm going to call 911 and lead them straight to him. I also told my fiancé about what happened. I haven't seen the guy since, but I'm still very on edge. I grew up in an extremely rural Midwest state. My family lived in the country between two small towns. I had attended school in both small towns and knew most of the families in the area by face or last name. One night, it was around 10 or 11, I was leaving a high school basketball game in town. I was around 15 and driving on my school permit past curfew. I borrowed my uncle's car, an early 90s Toyota with a leak in the gas tank that caused me to run out of gas before I made it more than 5 or 6 miles out of town. I had at least 7 left to go. I was on a long stretch of road that served as a shortcut between 2 main highways. There was very few houses that I passed on the way. If I did pass some, they were stretched a long way from each other. Cell phone reception was very bad too. I waited a while, and finally, a newer red truck with an extended cab, a toolbox in the back, and a construction company logo on the side pulled up. It was a Friday or Saturday night. There was a man inside with a woman and 2 girls. He offered me his phone. I remembered noticing it was a track phone. My friends and I referred to these as crack phones, because you can't trace the owners, and they're frequently used by drug dealers. They're also used a lot by people who can't afford a smartphone plan. But the family was driving a really nice vehicle. They seemed super clean cut, so it struck me as odd. The phone got no reception. I tried calling my parents a few times and finally given up. The truck had been headed away from Town B towards Town A, where I'd just come from, so when they offered me a ride through, I thought nothing of it. I had a gas can in the trunk and all of my friends lived in Town A, so I figured they could drop me off at the gas station on the way to their destination, and I could find a ride back with somebody I knew. When I got in the car, I was caught off guard by the way the woman, who I assumed was his wife, and the two girls were dressed. Conservative families, even Amish and Mennonites, weren't uncommon where I'm from. But for the man being otherwise modern, wearing jeans, driving a sort of flashy truck, and owning a cell phone, the female clothing surprised me. They all wore long heavy skirts with button-up blouses and thin bonnets on their heads. One of the girls seemed to have a disability and made a grunting noise every so often. Other than that, the women were completely silent. Everything seemed fine to me until the man driving turned around and started driving in the opposite way he had been coming from. The closest town was about 15 miles away. It seemed out of his way. Out of politeness, I reminded him that I come from Town A, knew everyone there, and could find a ride home. It's late, and I figured he needed to get his family where they were going. That's when he told me that he's from Town B, and that he had a full gas can waiting at his home, and that he would take me there and bring me back to my car to fill it up. Still trying to be polite, I told him it's unnecessary, and that my home was on the way to Town B. Just a few miles away, he could drop me there. I looked at him. He looked away and never replied. I started to feel like something was off. I'm from an area where people go out of their way to help others, but it seemed like too much. I had insisted numerous times that he didn't have to drive nearly 30 miles out of his way to get me gas. He could simply drop me off on his way to his destination, or if he wanted to make sure I made it home fine, he could drop me off there. Now in my uneasiness, I began some small talk. I said, "What's his name?" His last name was unfamiliar to me, which is surprising, but not totally unbelievable, coming from a town of around 3,000 people where I spent the first decade of my life, and where both of my parents still worked. I remembered wishing that I'd paid attention to the construction company name on the side of the truck, since most companies in my area were named after a family. As we got closer to the turnoff, I got more frantic. I realized that these people didn't seem overly friendly, were insisting that we drive completely out of the way late in the night in a rural community to fix a fairly commonplace mishap. I had no idea who they were. I've never seen them before. I had no cell phone reception, and their cell phone was undetachable. Even if it wasn't what they were trying to do, making me disappear would be an easy task. I then started kind of shrieking that they just dropped me off at my home. No one said they heard me though. Finally, in a panic, I screamed, "This is my turn. Take me home right now." Finally, for the first time, the wife spoke up, yelling at the man somewhat angrily, saying, "Just take her home." Outside of the girls grunting, the car went silent. He swerved angrily on my road, pulled into my driveway. He then let me out and reversed out of the driveway so fast that the tyres spit gravel and I couldn't even see the registration plate. I then ran back inside to tell my parents what had happened. They just yelled at me because I was driving past a curfew. I'll never know for sure what their intentions were. Maybe they wanted to help. But I had a really bad experience from that whole thing. I hope it never happens again. So over the past couple of years, I've shared this story at many parties, dinners, etc. And one of my friends thought you guys would like to hear it. So here it is. September 2010. My boyfriend Dave and his best friend Tony, my best friend Liz, and I are all coming back to our hometown for our final year of college after spending the summer in London. We all had a really fantastic time, staying at my uncle's apartment, partying and exploring such a big city with all its history. It's great. We stopped in a B&B that night at about halfway on the way home. We were planning to get home at about 6 PM. We all woke up early, about 4, maybe 5, ready to set off again, when we discovered that somebody had obviously driven too close to our car and broken the rear mirror off. Seeing as this was my dad's birthday present to me, I barely had it 2 months. I was fuming. We asked the landlady where we could possibly find spares, or something to use for the time being. She said she'd driven past a makeshift scrapyard or something a while back. She wasn't sure if it was still there, but she drew us a rough map, and we got back on the road. I wasn't very sure about the direction she'd given, because the closer we got to the area she had circled it in, the more desolate the surroundings were. The roads got more difficult, and had gone from stone to dirt. Around us, there weren't any farms anymore, just long, weedy grass and patches of forest. It had basically become a moor. We were about to head off because of the wild animals, and I just have to get over being a paranoid driver and deal without my wing mirror. When surely enough, my boyfriend pointed out in front of a handwritten sign directing us 2 miles down the road to Calf and Car Spares. We drove down into a little cove surrounded by forest. We all got out, except for my friend Liz. She was asleep in the back seat. There was a tiny cream hut with calf spray painted on the roof, a caravan, and a hill of metal and car bits. As was expected, we're the only visitors there. The sun was up, but no lights or people are around. I guess they're all sleeping. It was still about 6 anyway. We all walked up to the scrap pile, and I had a fumble through, looking for a wing mirror or any sort of mirror that could do for the time being until I could get it repaired. Tony picked up what could only be at least a decade-old mirror, suggesting we take it and go. But me, being stupid sincere, suggested that we have to go and give money for it. I can't go and take it, so I knock on the door and wait. A big, hard-faced man answered the door, and at first looked to be angry and tired, then smiled to me with a two-tooth smile. He leered at me for a few seconds, then, seeing the boys approach, said, "What do we want?" Tony handed in the mirror and said how much did he want for it. He said nothing, just to get to know us. I thought fair enough. 2 more men then left the patio door on the side. They turned and smiled. Both skinheads with meth teeth. They stank. He gave them the mirror and told them to go and attach it to the car. He introduces himself as Ian, sat us down on the patio chairs, offered us some sandwiches. I politely declined, but he insisted that we must have been hungry, telling me to come in, that women are gonna make the best sandwiches. I declined, finding him a little bit weird at this point. Again, Dave more sternly reinforced that I didn't want to come in. Ian muttered something, and then came and sat on the chairs with us. It became awkward very quick, as he began asking questions. Starting off innocently, then weird questions. We sat in silence until we heard Liz scream. We turned around. I saw one of the men that was meant to be fixing the back window with his hand around, gripped on Liz's leg. The other was looking around nervously behind the car. We got up immediately, sprinted off to the patio, Tony running after the guys, but they both headed into the forest. Liz was hysterical. She'd woken up to find herself on her own in the car and a man's hand running up her leg. I can't even imagine how terrifying that must have felt. I got into the back seat with her and consoled her while Dave came around the other side to get in and told us some nails were on the floor. We looked over. There's about 12 of them arranged around the tire, like the guy was ready to pop them. I couldn't really think why at the time, but I wondered how they got all the parts. We decided it's enough. We didn't want to spend any more time there, and we didn't want the mirror. So we got back to the car, closed the back seat door, and we looked back and saw Ian re-emerging from the home with something long in his hands and running towards us. My vision was then able to adjust. He got a bit closer. He was holding a hunting rifle. At this point, I burst into tears and hit the engine, slamming the accelerator as hard as possible. The car started to go and we get up to about 100, forgetting the dirt road and just driving over whatever until the scrapyard's out of sight. We didn't stop looking behind us until we were safely on the motorway getting home.